So yesterday I was doing this video about the counter offensive, and I was citing Jake Bro and showing a clip from him and the Combat Veteran Reacts and a few others. And on the other side was Jackson Hinkle. Now, if you don't know who Jackson Hinkle is, he is a commentator on the other side of this equation who regularly cites Putin and RT. And yesterday he was quoting Kim Jong-un as if it was a good thing. And I just found it absolutely amazing that he had this perspective. And I thought to myself, it's interesting because only here can he actually have that perspective. If he was in Russia and said anything against the special military operation, you can't call it a war, he could go to jail for calling it a war. He can have all the freedom of speech that he wants here, but in Russia they don't even acknowledge freedom of speech. Now, props to Russian Media Monitor for finding this. This is the head of RT talking about how freedom of speech works, or actually doesn't work. Okay, what is freedom of information, freedom of speech? What is there to say? Your generation, even though our difference in age, it's not that big, but considering our country's history, it is significant. Were you an adult in the 80s? I was a child. My generation is a lot less naive. We never fell for this bait. Wow, hold on a second. So freedom of speech is bait? That's how she's framing it. Now, I have to implore you to understand that the lady that you're looking at here is the editor of RT, Russia Today, a state-run newspaper that is the mouthpiece of propaganda. And when RT publishes something, it's very often just cut and paste and popped into a Islamic paper or African paper or an Asian paper. And it's a really bizarre thing to see. Like, I've done this a number of times. Just cut and paste the entire article, popped it into Google, and saw it replicated multiple times in different formats in these different countries. So she knows what she's talking about here. You grew up in a closed system. In the 1980s and part of the 1990s, you still believed that freedom of speech existed. In the necessity of this alleged freedom of speech here, in the same way they supposedly have it there. I'm assuming she means supposedly there being the West. For us, it was obvious that this is total nonsense, that this is just a military ruse. Did you hear that? It's just a military ruse, this whole idea of freedom of speech, because the info war is part of war. Freedom of speech works only with respect. Wow. To the words of someone specific. Secondly, it works as long as this speech, which runs counter to the agenda of the establishment, does not become too loud like Tucker Carlson. Wow. So she's comparing Tucker Carlson and his freedom of speech. So let's go back a step. Freedom of speech means not that you get to say whatever I agree with, but you get to say things that I don't agree with. That's the whole point of it. If I agree with it, there's no need for this freedom of speech. But when we don't agree, that's when you still have it, and that's when you see that that's a freedom. Now, she's going to compare this to Tucker Carlson, and there's no contest between whatever Tucker crazy nutty things he wants to say is in the United States and what they can or can't say in Russia. Like, you can go to jail for calling this a war. Before he was unceremoniously fired by Fox News, Tucker Carlson, who was very rudely fired, was the most popular TV host in America. Well, okay, one, I'm not sure that he was the most popular TV host. He did have quite a following, but he wasn't fired just for freedom of speech. There were other mitigating issues related to what he was fired for. So, hold on a second. There is the harshest censorship, an iron curtain controlling information all over the world. So she's saying that the United States is the harshest censorship, likening it to an iron curtain. And she's saying this in Russia. Now, it's okay for her to say this in Russia. It's like the old joke that Reagan talked about. There's an American and Russian. The American said, well, I can go into the White House and say, Mr. Reagan, I don't agree with your policies and they ought to change. And the Russian said, that's no problem. I can say that too. He said, you can? He said, yes, I can go into the Kremlin and I can say to Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Reagan's policies ought to change. And it's kind of like that. That's the kind of freedom of speech that they actually have. For me personally, Instagram was the last way of conveying information. They closed my personal account there 1 month ago. It's not true that information knows no boundaries. They'll throw Tucker Carlson off Twitter, and that's it. They'll never throw him off Twitter. What are you saying? Didn't they throw Trump off? Yes, Trump was thrown off. But this one won't be ever. I don't think that after what just happened to Trump, Musk will allow Tucker to be thrown off. Musk will be thrown out himself. Pardon me, Margot. Here's what I will say. If they don't throw him off Twitter, they will kill him. Now, again, this is a Russian mindset, okay? So they're going to assassinate or throw someone off a balcony or something along these lines because they think in these kind of categories. I was watching 1420 once, and just like the kinds of questions that they were asking just man on the street interviews, and they're saying, are you disturbed that people, the oligarchs and high important businessmen keep falling off balconies? And well, people fall off balconies and hotels all the time all over the world. Not at the same rate. There's a statistical difference here. So it's just that's the mentality. Do you like this alternative? Musk will be imprisoned for some tax crimes. Wow, that's another really interesting thing. He's going to be imprisoned for tax crimes. That's what they do in Russia more often than not to their oligarchs or businessmen or whoever they're trying to entrap or send to prison who has misbehaved within their system. And Trump as well. She's perfectly describing the way of unsolvable problems get solved through America's history. People who are not in this field of information, which is not your fault since you don't deal with this, still harbor an illusion that in the modern world, information has no boundaries. This is absolutely categorically false. In recent years, the entire Western world was transformed to resemble North Korea. Are you hearing what they're saying? The Western world is like North Korea in the way that they deal with people who want to have free speech. That's what she's actually saying. All dissent is immediately crushed the instant it becomes notable. Listen, we have more freedom of speech here. I'm honestly bored even talking about it. It's all so obvious. Freedom of speech does not exist, period. Okay, so she's saying two things. There's more free speech in Russia, which is categorically and patently false. And then we have just as much free speech in Russia. Well, okay, there's a reason that she's saying it like she is. A liar doesn't believe anyone else. RT routinely lies, and they assume that that's what's going on everywhere else. Now, there is something to this in the sense that people can't trust particularly conservatives have a hard time trusting the Western mainstream media. But the Western mainstream media is a slanted narrative. It's not just patently false. There are facts, but the facts are shaped to tell the story in maybe a slanted way. So it's like polluted water. But that's very different than raw sewage. And we have to wrap our minds around the difference between the two, or we're just going to buy her raw sewage narrative that freedom of speech is totally gone. I may be mistaken, but here's how I see one of your functions. You're a sort of feedback loop within the government. Wow, that's exactly right. That's exactly what her role at RT is. It's to propagate the government's message and then keep it going. They pay attention to you. You're not opposition. You support the government. But if you sound the alarm, it means that the excesses are so egregious that it should be noticed and perhaps reconsidered. Well, of course, that also means that she's going to be one of those people thrown off a balcony or sent to prison for tax evasion. I have a question. Don't you think that right now it's time for you to sound an alarm? Here are a few examples. About what? In Krasnoyarsk, a deputy at local city, Igor Grinov, was found guilty of discrediting the Russian army for saying that residents of Kherson were left behind after they placed their hopes in Russia. Okay, so that's a pretty minor offense compared to other things. All he's saying is, oh, we shouldn't leave these people behind because after all, they're now Russians according to their own propaganda. I don't see this as discrediting the army. I see pain in the words and can easily imagine you're saying this during one of the programs. Simonyan says, yes. Another one is a notorious case of the theater director. She is held in confinement for a theater play that ran for 2 years, having been approved by the Ministry of Culture and other agencies. Okay, first, if you have to get your play approved by the Ministry of Culture, you're not free. I mean, that's just the way it works, right? And other agencies. Then, retroactively, they found some crime in it, and she's being brought to the hearings in handcuffs like a criminal. Okay, that's called an ex post facto law. That's a law made after the fact. It's wiped out in the Western tradition. Thank you to the Brits with the Magna Carta and the other corpus of the various documents that make up the British Constitution that we inherited. We're grateful for that. My third example is the case of Sergei Vedel. He used to work for a police department. His telephone conversations were wiretapped. It wasn't even related to him. His boss was under an investigation. In these phone conversations, he spoke openly to his friends and relatives about what he thought about the situation in Ukraine. They labeled it as discrediting and spreading fakes. Wow. So he was talking in a private conversation about the war in Ukraine and got in trouble for doing that when he's wiretapped and didn't know it. So he has no freedom of speech. He has to keep... Now, here's the thing. Jordan Peterson talks about this quite a bit. The reason that freedom of speech is important is because if I can muzzle your speech, I can muzzle your thinking. If you can't articulate what you really believe, then I've enslaved you, essentially. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. There was also an Orwellian moment. Since he was being wiretapped, prosecutors claimed that the policeman who was listening in experienced feelings of concern, fear, and vulnerability. It turns out we have to censor our words and thoughts, even our conversations with parents and kids. Where is this boundary where we will cross over and become a totalitarian country? Now that's a really good question, but the problem is you're already kind of there. It might feel like it's not, but there's a soft totalitarianism in Russia where multiple, and if you watch from the beginning of where the war began and the number of laws that were passed, and you start tracking these laws and see how, like, just ask yourself, are you more or less free with the laws that the Duma and President Putin has signed since the war began? Are you more or less free? You're far less free if you're a Russian citizen. So you're becoming a totalitarian state if you're not fully on there. You just don't know it. Dmitry brought up our vision of the future. Does this vision fit into the vision of our future? Are you concerned that if these cases multiply, our beloved country will become unfit for living? Hey, look, that's a really good question because he's asking the person that in the United States, ahead of a major news network in the United States, would be a watchdog. Like, that's what they called the press. She's not a watchdog. She's a guard dog watching the people on behalf of the government instead of the other way around. Perhaps it's time for you to sound your alarm that works without fail to alert the authorities. Don't worry, it won't become a totalitarian country if everything does not end in a nuclear war. Wow. Well, okay, so I urge you to watch The Other Side, because when you watch The Other Side, you're no longer dealing with a straw man. Now, we can watch The Other Side, but they can't. See, this is part of the problem. They only get the picture of us in the West like she is going to paint us. I'm asking you to go and look at these guys so that you can see them as they are, what they actually think, what they actually have to say, why they're saying what they have to say. And when she's saying that free speech is an illusion, she means it, because in her world, with what she does, free speech is really an illusion. Okay, I hope that's instructive and helps you understand how they're thinking, why they're thinking the way they're thinking, and it should just add some context, build some dendrites in your brain as you're working out your own scaffolding about how the Russians think about prosecuting the war in Ukraine. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, subscribes, for the shares. I really appreciate this. When you share this on social media, the video blows up, and I can't thank you enough for having done that, because it's helping other people become educated about what's going on in the war in Ukraine. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.